Imagine this. A mysterious hand appears from thin air, fingers blazing with supernatural fire, writing strange words on a palace wall. The most powerful king on earth watches in terror as the message appears before his eyes. Outside his fortress walls, an army waits in the darkness, ready to bring down an empire that has ruled the world for generations. But here's the twist that will blow your mind. The man leading that army has no idea he's about to fulfill a prophecy written about him 150 years before he was even born. A prophecy that calls him by name and declares him God's chosen instrument, even though he doesn't know God and has never heard of the people he's destined to save. Have you ever felt like you're not good enough for God to use? Have you ever thought that because of your background, your mistakes, or your differences, God could never work through you? Well, today's story is going to shatter those limiting beliefs forever. This is the incredible true story of Cyrus the Great, a pagan king who became God's unlikely hero. A man who conquered the greatest empire of his time, not for his own glory, but to fulfill a divine plan he didn't even understand. Get ready for a journey that will show you just how limitless God's power really is, and how he can use absolutely anyone, anywhere, at any time to accomplish his purposes. So settle in, because what you're about to discover will change how you see God's ability to work through the most unexpected people in the most extraordinary ways. Long before our story truly begins, we need to travel back to a time when hope seemed impossible. The great city of Jerusalem lay in ruins. Solomon's magnificent temple, once the glory of the ancient world, had been reduced to rubble and ash. The people of Israel had been torn from their homeland and carried away as prisoners to a foreign land called Babylon. Picture the scene: families separated, children crying, elderly people stumbling along dusty roads, leaving behind everything they had ever known. Their captors were ruthless. Their future seemed hopeless. Many wondered if God had forgotten them entirely. But in the midst of this darkness, something extraordinary happened. God spoke through his prophet Isaiah, and the words he gave were so shocking, so impossible, that they must have seemed like fantasy to anyone who heard them. Isaiah declared that a man would come, a man who would be called God's anointed one. This man would have the power to set the captives free, to rebuild the temple, and to restore Israel to their homeland. But here's the part that must have left people speechless. This Savior would not be one of them. He wouldn't be a Jew. He wouldn't even know their God. The prophecy went even further. It gave this future deliverer a name: Cyrus. God said, "This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue nations before him." Think about how impossible this must have seemed. At the time Isaiah spoke these words, there was no Persian Empire. There was no king named Cyrus. In fact, Cyrus wouldn't even be born for another century and a half. Yet God spoke of him as if he already knew him personally, as if this future king's victory was already accomplished in heaven. This prophecy was like a time capsule, waiting for the right moment to be opened and understood. For generations, the Jewish people would wonder about these mysterious words. Who is this Cyrus? When would he come? And how could a foreign king possibly be God's chosen instrument? While the Jewish people waited in exile, on the other side of the ancient world, something remarkable was beginning to unfold. In the mountainous region of Persia, a young prince was growing up who would change the course of history forever. His name was Cyrus. Now, Cyrus wasn't raised knowing anything about the God of Israel or the prophecies written about him. He was brought up in the Persian royal court, learning the ways of his ancestors, studying military strategy, and preparing to rule over his people. To him, the Jewish captives in Babylon were just another group of displaced people in a world full of conquered nations. But God had his hand on this young prince in ways that nobody could see. As Cyrus grew older, he displayed remarkable leadership abilities. He was brilliant in battle, wise in politics, and surprisingly merciful to the people he conquered. Unlike other ancient rulers who were known for their cruelty, Cyrus became famous for allowing conquered peoples to keep their customs and religions. One by one, Cyrus began conquering the kingdoms around him. Each victory made his empire larger and more powerful. His armies seemed unstoppable. His reputation grew throughout the ancient world. But the greatest test was still ahead of him, the mighty city of Babylon. Inside the great city of Babylon, King Belshazzar was throwing the party of a lifetime. He was the grandson of the famous King Nebuchadnezzar, the man who had destroyed Jerusalem and carried the Jews into captivity. But unlike his grandfather, Belshazzar had no respect for the power that had made Babylon great. The king decided to make his feast extra special by doing something shocking and sacrilegious. He ordered his servants to bring out the golden cups and vessels that his grandfather had stolen from the temple in Jerusalem. These weren't just any dishes, they were sacred items that had been dedicated to the God of Israel. As Belshazzar and his guests drank wine from these holy vessels, they praised their own gods and mocked the God of the Jews. They laughed and celebrated, completely unaware that outside their city walls, Cyrus and his Persian army were preparing for attack. But then, in the middle of their wild party, something happened that turned their celebration into a nightmare. A hand appeared out of nowhere, glowing with supernatural fire, and began writing mysterious words on the palace wall. The room fell deadly silent. The king's face went white with terror. His knees began to shake so violently that he could barely stand. The words written on the wall were, "Mean, Tekel, Upharsin." Nobody in the room could understand what they meant, but somehow everyone knew they spelled doom for Babylon. The king called for all his wise men and magicians, but none of them could interpret the writing. Finally, someone remembered Daniel, the Jewish prophet who had served in the palace for decades. When Daniel was brought before the terrified king, he didn't hesitate to explain what the message meant. Daniel looked at the writing and then at the king. His voice was steady and clear as he delivered what amounted to a death sentence. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom will be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That very night, while the people of Babylon were still reeling from the supernatural warning, Cyrus and his army found a way into the supposedly impregnable city. Through careful planning and divine providence, they diverted the Euphrates River and entered Babylon through the riverbed. By morning, the greatest empire in the world had fallen, and Cyrus the Great was its new ruler. Belshazzar was dead, exactly as Daniel had predicted. The prophecy that had been written 150 years earlier was beginning to come true. Now, you might expect that after conquering Babylon, Cyrus would do what most ancient conquerors did: plunder the city, enslave the people, and impose Persian culture on everyone. But something extraordinary happened instead. While exploring the treasures and libraries of Babylon, Cyrus made a discovery that would change not just his life, but the course of history itself. He found a scroll, an ancient prophecy written by Isaiah the prophet. As he read it, he must have felt his blood run cold with amazement. There, written in black and white, was his own name. Not just any name that sounded similar, his exact name, Cyrus. And the prophecy didn't just mention him in passing. It described him as God's anointed one, chosen to accomplish a specific mission, to set the Jewish captives free and help them rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. Imagine how Cyrus must have felt reading those words. Here was a document written long before he was born, by a prophet of a God he had never worshipped, describing his conquests and calling him by name. It wasn't just coincidence, it was impossible to explain by human understanding alone. The scroll told him that he would issue a decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland. It said he would provide them with resources to rebuild their temple. It even mentioned that he would return the sacred vessels that had been stolen from Jerusalem. He issued a royal decree that shocked everyone who heard it. The decree was simple but revolutionary. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel. And may their God be with them. But Cyrus didn't stop there. He didn't just give permission for the Jews to leave. He commanded that they be given financial support for their journey. He ordered that the people living in the areas where Jews were scattered should provide them with silver, gold, livestock, and free will offerings for the temple. To make his decree even more remarkable, Cyrus personally returned all the sacred vessels and articles that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen from the first temple. These precious items, including the golden cups that Belshazzar had used in his final, blasphemous feast, were carefully cataloged and prepared for the journey back to Jerusalem. Can you imagine the joy that swept through the Jewish communities when they heard this news? After 70 years in exile, after decades of wondering if God had forgotten them, suddenly the doors to freedom were thrown wide open. Not only could they go home, but they were being sent with royal support and their sacred treasures restored. The journey from Babylon back to Jerusalem wasn't easy. It covered hundreds of miles of dangerous territory through deserts and mountain passes. But for the Jewish exiles, every step was a step toward home, toward the fulfillment of promises their grandparents had clung to in faith. Led by leaders like Zerubbabel and later Ezra, thousands of Jewish families packed up their belongings and began the long trek westward. They carried with them not just their possessions, but their hopes, their dreams, and the sacred vessels that Cyrus had returned to them. When they finally reached Jerusalem, what they found must have been both heartbreaking and inspiring. The city lay in ruins, just as they had left it decades earlier. Weeds grew between broken stones. The Temple Mount was empty except for rubble and memories. But these were not the same people who had been carried away as captives. They were strengthened by their years of testing, motivated by the miraculous way God had provided for their return, and determined to rebuild what had been destroyed. They started with the altar, then began laying the foundation for a new temple. As the foundation stones were put in place, something beautiful happened. The older men who remembered Solomon's original temple wept with mixed emotions, sadness for what had been lost, but joy for what was being restored. The younger people who had only heard stories of the first temple shouted with celebration at seeing their dreams come true. But not everyone was happy about the Jews' return. The surrounding peoples had gotten used to the land being empty. Some had moved into areas that had once belonged to Israel. Others feared that a restored Jewish nation might become a threat to their own security. These opponents wrote letters to the Persian governors, trying to convince them that the Jews were building not just a temple, but a fortress that could be used to rebel against the Persian Empire. They painted the reconstruction project as a dangerous political movement that could threaten peace in the region. For a while, their tactics worked. The Persian governors, concerned about potential rebellion, ordered the work on the temple to stop. The Jewish people were devastated. Had they come so far only to be stopped just short of their goal? But remember, this was God's plan, and no human opposition could ultimately stop it. When word of the situation reached the Persian court, investigators were sent to examine the claims against the Jews. What they found in the royal archives changed everything. There, carefully preserved, was Cyrus's original decree. The investigators could see clearly that the Jewish people weren't rebels. They were acting in complete obedience to royal commands. Not only were they authorized to rebuild the temple, but they were supposed to receive government support for their work. The result was a new royal decree, this time even stronger than the first. The Persian king commanded that not only should the Jews be allowed to continue their work, but that anyone who tried to stop them would face severe punishment. The temple construction resumed with even greater enthusiasm than before. Years passed, and slowly but surely, the new temple rose from the ruins of the old. It wasn't as magnificent as Solomon's temple had been. They didn't have the same resources or the same peaceful conditions. But it was beautiful in its own way, and more importantly, it represented the faithfulness of God to his promises. When the temple was finally completed, the Jewish people celebrated with joy that must have echoed across the hills of Jerusalem. They offered sacrifices of thanksgiving, knowing that their restoration was complete. God's presence would once again dwell among his people in the holy city. For Cyrus, his role in this divine drama had been fulfilled perfectly. He had been God's instrument to bring about one of the most remarkable restorations in history. A pagan king had been used to accomplish what no Jewish leader had been able to do: bring the people home and rebuild their temple. The Bible doesn't tell us much about what happened to Cyrus after this great accomplishment. History records that he continued to rule his vast empire with wisdom and justice until his death. But his greatest legacy wasn't his military conquests or his political achievements. It was his role in fulfilling God's promise to restore his people. So what can we learn from this incredible story? What does the tale of a Persian king from 2,500 years ago have to teach us in our modern world? First, it shows us that God's ability to use people is absolutely limitless. Cyrus wasn't a believer. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't even seeking to serve God when he began his conquests. But God saw something in him that could be used for divine purposes, and he orchestrated events to place Cyrus exactly where he needed to be at exactly the right time. This should give hope to anyone who has ever felt unqualified or unworthy to be used by God. If God could use a pagan king to fulfill prophecy and restore his people, then he can certainly use you, no matter what your background, no matter what mistakes you've made, no matter how ordinary you might feel. Second, Cyrus's story teaches us that God is always working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it. For 70 years, it looked like God had forgotten the Jewish people. Their temple was destroyed, their city was ruined, and they were prisoners in a foreign land. But all that time, God was preparing their deliverer, raising up Cyrus, positioning him for victory, and orchestrating one of the most remarkable rescues in history. When you're going through difficult times, when it seems like your prayers aren't being answered, when you wonder if God really cares about your situation, remember Cyrus and the Jewish exiles. God may be preparing something amazing that you can't even imagine yet. Third, this story shows us the importance of using whatever influence or power we have for purposes bigger than ourselves. Cyrus could have used his position purely for personal gain. He could have kept the Jewish people as slaves, hoarded their treasures, and ignored their plight. Instead, he chose to use his power to restore hope and freedom to an oppressed people. Whatever position you hold, whatever influence you have, whatever resources are at your disposal, God may want to use them to bless others and advance his kingdom. The question is, are you willing to be his instrument? Finally, Cyrus's story reminds us that God's plans always come to pass, even if they take longer than we expect. The prophecy about Cyrus was given 150 years before he was born. The Jewish exile lasted 70 years. But every detail of God's plan was fulfilled exactly as he had promised. In our instant gratification world, we often get impatient when God doesn't work according to our timeline. But Cyrus's story teaches us that God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't match our expectations. He knows exactly when and how to accomplish his purposes. Maybe you're reading this today and you feel like your life is in exile. Maybe you're in a place you never wanted to be, facing challenges you never expected, wondering if God has forgotten about you. Maybe you feel like your dreams have been destroyed and your future looks hopeless. If that's where you are, then Cyrus's story is especially for you. Just as God didn't forget the Jewish people during their 70 years in Babylon, he hasn't forgotten you in your current situation. Just as he was preparing Cyrus to be their deliverer while they were still in captivity, he may be preparing something amazing for your life that you can't even see yet. Or maybe you're in a position of influence or authority, and you're wondering how God might want to use you. Remember that Cyrus was chosen not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to be used. God doesn't need perfect people, he needs available people. The same God who could speak Cyrus's name 150 years before he was born knows your name too. The same God who could orchestrate the fall of Babylon and the rise of Persia can orchestrate the circumstances of your life. The same God who could use a pagan king to restore his people can use you to accomplish his purposes in ways you've never dreamed possible. The story of Cyrus the Great reminds us that God's ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. He can use anyone from anywhere at any time to accomplish his perfect will. He can take the most unlikely people and make them heroes of faith. He can turn exile into restoration, defeat into victory, and despair into hope. Cyrus never became a follower of the God of Israel, as far as we know. But he served God's purposes perfectly, and his name is forever linked with one of the greatest acts of divine mercy in history. He shows us that God's love and power extend far beyond the boundaries we might expect. If this story has touched your heart today, if it's given you hope or challenged you to think differently about how God might want to use your life, I'd love to hear about it. Please take a moment to share in the comments how Cyrus's story has inspired you. And speaking of comments, what other Bible stories would you like to see us explore? There are so many incredible accounts of God working through ordinary people in extraordinary ways. Stories of faith, courage, redemption, and hope that can encourage us in our own journeys. If you found this story meaningful and want to see more like it, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these amazing biblical accounts to life and sharing them with people around the world. Remember, the same God who had a plan for Cyrus has a plan for you too. You may not see it yet, you may not understand it completely, but He knows exactly what He's doing in your life. Trust Him, make yourself available to Him, and be ready to be amazed by what He can accomplish through you. Thanks for joining us for this incredible journey through history. We'll see you in the next video, where we'll discover another amazing story of how God works through ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Until then, remember, you are never too ordinary for God to use in extraordinary ways.